Imagine a land where two great rivers flow like silver ribbons across the landscape, their waters carving paths through valleys and plains for thousands of years. This is the land we now call China, and those rivers, the Yellow River, with its golden, silt-laden currents, and the Yangtze, winding through lush central regions, are more than just bodies of water. They are the lifeblood of one of the world's oldest and most enduring cultures, a civilization that would stretch back over 3,000 years, weaving a tapestry of traditions, innovations, and stories that still echo today. Let's start with the Yellow River, often called the Sorrow by those who lived along its banks. It's easy to see why. Its waters, swollen by monsoons or melting snow from the high mountains, would sometimes burst their banks, flooding villages and farmlands, leaving destruction in their wake. But here's the paradox: those same floods were a gift. When the waters receded, they left behind a thick layer of nutrient-rich silt, a natural fertilizer that made the surrounding soil some of the most fertile on Earth. It was this silt that lured early people to settle along the river, planting seeds and watching them grow into bountiful crops, turning nomadic wanderers into farmers with roots in the land. To the south, the Yangtze River painted a different picture. Its waters were calmer, its valleys greener, and its climate warmer. Here, the land favored a different kind of farming, wet rice paddies that glistened like mirrors under the sun. The people who settled here learned to tend these paddies with care, building intricate irrigation systems to channel water where it was needed. Over time, these two agricultural zones, one in the north, thriving on drought-resistant millet, and one in the south, rich with rice, would grow and eventually connect, forming the heart of a shared culture. Now, let's step back and look at the bigger map. This land was shaped by more than just rivers. To the north and west, vast deserts stretched like golden seas, their shifting sands acting as a natural wall. To the south, dense subtropical forests and jagged mountain ranges rose, while to the east, the endless blue of the Pacific Ocean kissed the shores. These natural boundaries didn't just protect the early people from distant strangers, they also let their culture grow in its own way, like a garden sheltered from strong winds. For a long time, the people here developed their own ideas about how to live, how to govern, and what mattered most, without too much interference from the world beyond. But make no mistake, this isolation wasn't total. Every now and then, travelers or traders would find their way through the mountains or deserts, bringing new ideas, new tools, or new stories. And when they did, the people here didn't just push these new things away. They folded them into their own way of life, like adding a new thread to an old tapestry. Take Buddhism, for example, which came from India much later. It didn't replace the old beliefs, it blended with them, creating something new yet familiar. This knack for adapting while staying true to their roots would become one of the civilization's greatest strengths. Let's journey back even further, to a time before cities or kings, when people lived in small groups, hunting animals and gathering wild plants. Archaeologists have found traces of these early people, dating back over 100,000 years. They left behind stone tools, bits of bone carved into simple shapes, and even evidence that they knew how to make fire, huddling around it for warmth and to cook their food. Life was hard, and every day was a struggle to survive, but slowly, over thousands of years, things began to change. Around 10,000 years ago, something remarkable happened: the Neolithic Revolution. Instead of chasing animals or searching for berries, people started to plant seeds on purpose. They learned which plants grew best in their soil, how to care for them, and when to harvest. This might sound simple, but it changed everything. If you could grow your own food, you didn't have to move around anymore. You could build a permanent home, a village, where families lived together, shared work, and raised children. In the north, along the Yellow River, the people discovered millet, a tough little grain that could grow even when the rains were scarce. They learned to plant it in neat rows, and soon, fields of millet stretched across the plains. Villages sprang up, with houses made of mud and straw, and storage pits dug into the ground to keep grain safe from rodents. Tools got better, too, sharp stone blades for cutting stalks, wooden plows to turn the soil. By around 8,000 years ago, cultures like the Palagang and Sishan were thriving here, with people living in settled communities, making pottery to store their grain, and even burying their dead with simple offerings, showing they believed in something beyond this life. In the south, along the Yangtze, a different story unfolded. Here, the people turned to rice. At sites like Himudu, in what is now Zhejiang province, archaeologists have found ancient rice paddies, along with tools made from bone, small, sharp knives for harvesting rice stalks, and wooden spades to shape the paddies. Rice farming was more work than growing millet. You had to flood the fields just right, keep the water from drying up, and transplant the young seedlings by hand. But it was worth it. Rice produced more food per acre than millet, so more people could live in one place. Villages grew larger, with houses built on stilts to stay dry during floods, and people began to specialize. Some became better farmers, others skilled at making pottery or weaving cloth. As these farming communities grew, something else began to take shape: social order. Not everyone had to farm anymore. Some people became leaders, making decisions about when to plant, how to share food, or how to protect the village from wild animals or other groups. Others became craftspeople, spending their days making pottery, tools, or jewelry. Some even became spiritual leaders, leading ceremonies to ask the gods for good harvests or to honor the dead. This division of labor, each person doing what they were best at, made communities stronger, but it also created differences. Some people had more food, better tools, or more respect than others. Slowly, social classes began to form, with leaders and craftspeople at the top, and farmers at the bottom. Pottery became more than just a practical tool, it became a form of art. The Yangshao culture, which flourished along the Yellow River around 5,000 years ago, made beautiful painted pottery, with swirling geometric patterns and stylized animals like fish and birds. These pots weren't just for storing grain, they were used in rituals, or buried with the dead as symbols of status. Later, the Longshan culture, which emerged around 3000 BCE, took pottery to new heights. They made thin, black pottery using a potter's wheel, with walls so delicate they were almost transparent. These pots showed off the skill of their makers, and owning one was a sign of wealth and power. Jade, too, became important. This hard, green stone was more precious than gold, not just for its beauty, but for its spiritual meaning. People believed jade had special powers, protecting the wearer from harm or helping them communicate with the gods. Craftspeople spent hours carving jade into intricate shapes, discs, blades, or animal figures, that were used in ceremonies or buried with kings and nobles. As villages grew into towns, and towns into cities, people needed ways to work together on big projects. They built walls around their settlements to keep out enemies, dug ditches to control floods, and constructed large public buildings for meetings or rituals. At sites like Liangzhu, near modern Shanghai, the city covered hundreds of acres, with sophisticated water systems that could both protect against floods and water the fields. Thousands of people lived here, each with their own role to play in this complex society. Along with these changes came stories about where people came from, and who had the right to lead. The most famous of these are the legends of the five emperors: Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, Xuanxiu, Ku, Yao, and Shun. These weren't just stories, they were lessons about what a good leader should be. Huangdi was said to have invented writing, the compass, and even silk production. showing that a leader should be wise and innovative. Yao was praised for creating the first calendar, using the stars to tell when to plant and harvest. Shun was known for his kindness and fairness, choosing his successor not because he was family, but because he was the most capable. One of the most important stories is about Yu the Great. According to legend, the Yellow River once flooded so badly that crops were destroyed and people were left homeless. Yao and Shun tried to stop the floods by building dams, but nothing worked. Then Yu took over. For 13 years, he traveled the land, digging channels to guide the floodwaters away from villages and into the sea. He worked so hard that he didn't go home once, even when he passed by his own door. In the end, he tamed the river, and the people could farm again. For his courage and wisdom, Yu was chosen as Shun's successor. Later, he founded the Xia dynasty, the first hereditary dynasty in Chinese history, where power passed from father to son, not just to the most capable person. We don't have a lot of physical evidence for the Xia dynasty, but archaeologists have found sites from around 2000 BCE that show signs of early states, large palaces, workshops for making bronze, and graves with valuable goods, showing that some people were more powerful than others. These sites suggest that by 2000 BCE, the foundations of Chinese civilization were firmly in place. People were farming in large, organized communities, making beautiful pottery and jade objects, and living in societies with leaders and laws. They had stories that tied them together, a shared way of seeing the world, and a sense that they were part of something bigger than themselves. This is where our story begins, not with kings or empires, but with people planting seeds, building homes, and telling stories under the stars. It's a story of how a land shaped by rivers, mountains, and deserts gave birth to a civilization that would endure for thousands of years, changing and growing, but always holding on to the threads that first wove it together. Let's drift further into the story, where small villages have grown into something more, a hint of nations taking shape. After Yu the Great tamed the floods, people looked to him not just as a hero, but as a leader who could keep their world balanced. When Yu passed away, instead of choosing the wisest person in the land to follow him, his son Qi took his place. This was a quiet revolution. For the first time, power stayed in one family, passing from father to son like an inheritance. And so, the Xia dynasty began, a line of rulers that would guide the land for centuries, from around 2070 BCE to 1600 BCE. We don't have many written records from the Xia, but the earth itself tells us stories. At sites like Erlitou, in what is now Hunan province, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of a grand palace, its foundations made of rammed earth, strong enough to hold up wooden beams and tiled roofs. Around it, there are workshops where skilled craftspeople forged bronze into tools, weapons, and ritual vessels. Some of these vessels are simple, like cooking pots, but others are ornate, with carvings that hint at the ceremonies they were used in. Graves nearby tell a tale of a divided society. Some are filled with jade ornaments and bronze treasures, while others have little more than a few pottery shards. Clearly, some people were more important than others, leaders, priests, or warriors, while most worked the fields, their lives tied to the rhythm of planting and harvesting. The Xia rulers faced a tricky balance. They needed to keep their people safe, make sure the crops grew, and stay in favor with the gods. Legend says that over time, some Xia kings forgot this balance. The last one, Jie, was said to be cruel. He built lavish palaces, ignored the needs of his people, and even laughed when they begged for help during a famine. People whispered that heaven was angry, that the Xia had lost the right to rule. And then, from the east, a new group emerged, the Shang. The Shang people were once subjects of the Xia, but they grew strong. Their leader, Tang, saw how unhappy the people were and decided it was time for a change. He gathered an army, not just of soldiers, but of farmers and craftspeople who were tired of Jie's tyranny. In the end, the Shang defeated the Xia, and Tang became the new king. This wasn't just a battle, it was a lesson. A ruler could only stay in power if they were virtuous, if they cared for their people. This idea, that heaven gives power to the worthy, and takes it away from the cruel, would echo through Chinese history for thousands of years. The Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE to 1046 BCE, was a leap forward in how people organized themselves. They built grand cities, first at Zhengzhou and later at Anyang, which became their final capital. Anyang was a bustling place. Imagine wide streets lined with houses, workshops where bronze workers hammered and melted metal, and temples where smoke curled up from sacrifices to the gods. The king's palace stood at the center, a vast complex with halls for meetings, rooms for storing treasures, and altars for rituals. Around it, the city spread out over 30 square kilometers, home to tens of thousands of people, from nobles to servants. What really set the Shang apart was writing. Before, people had used symbols, but the Shang created a system of characters that could record stories, laws, and even questions to the gods. These weren't written on paper, paper hadn't been invented yet. Instead, they carved them into turtle shells or the shoulder blades of cows, which we now call oracle bones. Here's how it worked. When the king wanted to know something: will it rain tomorrow? Should we go to war with the neighboring tribe? Will the queen have a healthy baby? He'd ask a priest to help. The priest would drill small holes into a bone, then heat it with a hot metal rod. The bone would crack, and the king would read the cracks to find the answer. Then, the question, the answer, and even whether the prediction came true would be carved into the bone. Over 150,000 of these oracle bone fragments have been found, each a tiny window into what the Shang cared about. The Shang believed in a world full of spirits. At the top was Di, the supreme god who controlled the weather, wars, and harvests. Below Di were the ancestors, especially the spirits of past kings, who were thought to watch over their living descendants. To keep these spirits happy, the Shang held elaborate ceremonies. They sacrificed animals, food, and even sometimes people, though this part is sad, and we'll gently step around it. The king was the bridge between the living and the dead, the only one who could speak directly to the most powerful ancestors. This made him not just a political leader, but a spiritual one too. Bronze was more than just metal to the Shang, it was a way to show power and connect with the gods. Their bronze workers were true artists, creating vessels in shapes like dragons, tigers, and birds, with intricate patterns that shimmered in the light. The largest of these, like the square ding tripod, weighed hundreds of kilograms and took teams of craftspeople to make. These vessels were used in sacrifices, wine was poured from one, meat cooked in another, and grain offered in a third. Owning such a vessel was a sign of great honor, only the king and the highest nobles could have them. Society under the Shang was like a pyramid. At the top was the king, surrounded by his family and the most powerful nobles. Below them were warriors who protected the kingdom, priests who performed rituals, and craftspeople who made bronze, jade, and pottery. Most people, though, were farmers, working the fields to grow millet, wheat, and a little rice. They lived in small villages, in houses made of mud and straw, and paid taxes with grain or labor. Some were slaves, captured in wars, who worked in the fields or served in noble households. The Shang were also warriors. They fought with neighboring tribes, called the Fang, to protect their land and get resources like wood, metal, and slaves. Their armies used bronze weapons, dagger axes, spears, and arrows, that were sharper and stronger than stone ones. Later, they even began using chariots, which were probably brought from the grasslands to the north. A chariot, drawn by 2 horses, could carry a driver and an archer, charging into battle faster than foot soldiers. These chariots weren't just weapons, they were symbols of power, showing how wealthy and organized the Shang were. But like the Xia before them, the Shang eventually lost their way. The last king, Zhou, was said to be even crueler than Jie. He built a palace with a lake of wine and a forest of meat, where he and his favorite concubine, Daji, would feast while his people starved. He punished anyone who criticized him, even inventing cruel tortures. People began to say that heaven had withdrawn its blessing. To the west, a tribe called the Zhou, who had long been allies of the Shang, grew angry. Their leader, King Wen, and later his son King Wu, gathered an army to put an end to Zhou's tyranny. The final battle happened at Mai, around 1046 BCE. King Wu's army was smaller, but his soldiers fought with fury, knowing they were fighting for justice. Many of the Shang's soldiers, tired of their king's cruelty, switched sides. When King Zhou saw he was defeated, he ran to his palace, set it on fire, and died in the flames. The Shang dynasty was over, but its legacy lived on, in its writing, its bronze art, and its idea that rulers must be virtuous to deserve their throne. As we drift toward sleep, picture the Shang cities at dusk, the sound of bronze bells from the temple, the smell of millet cooking in hearths, and scribes carefully carving questions into bones by the light of oil lamps. These people were building more than a kingdom, they were building a way of life that would shape China for centuries to come. They asked big questions: how do we live together? How do we please the gods? And what makes a ruler worthy? Their answers, written in bone and bronze, are still part of our story today. Let us sink deeper into the tapestry of Shang and Zhou culture, where every thread, whether of bronze, ink, or ritual, weaves a story of human ingenuity and spiritual longing. This was an age when people did not merely live in the world, they spoke to it, through art, writing, and ceremony, as if the mountains, rivers, and stars were listening. The Shang obsession with bronze reached heights that still dazzle today. Imagine a craftsman's workshop in Anyang, the air thick with the smell of molten metal and charcoal, the clatter of hammers ringing like a chorus. Here, artisans did not just make bronze, they conjured it. They mined copper from distant hills, tin from river valleys, and mixed them in precise ratios, knowing that too much tin would make the metal brittle, too little would leave it soft. Then, they shaped clay molds, not with random patterns, but with images that told stories: a dragon coiled around a vessel's neck, its scales carved so finely they seemed to ripple, a tiger's face with bulging eyes and sharp fangs, a symbol of power and protection. When the molten bronze poured into these molds, it was as if the animals came alive, frozen mid-roar or mid-flight. These vessels were not meant for ordinary meals. The largest ding tripods, some standing as tall as a person, were used only by kings in ceremonies to honor their ancestors. Picture a moonlit ritual: the king, robed in silk dyed with indigo, stands before a row of bronze vessels. Priests chant ancient verses, and servants pour wine into a gu cup, its narrow neck curving like a bird's beak. The wine is offered to the spirits, then poured onto the ground, where it soaks into the soil, a gift to the ancestors who dwelled beneath the earth. The ding holds chunks of meat, roasted over a fire, and when the ceremony ends, the king and nobles share the meat, binding themselves to both the living and the dead. The Shang did not just use bronze for rituals, though. They made weapons too: dagger axes with blades sharp enough to cut through bone, spears tipped with bronze points that glinted in battle. But even these weapons carried meaning. A warrior's spear might have a handle carved with his family's symbol, so that his ancestors would recognize him in battle and lend their strength. Bronze, in short, was a bridge between the practical and the sacred, between killing and praying, between the human and the divine. Then there was writing, the Shang's most revolutionary gift to the future. Oracle bones were not just question papers to the gods, they were the first step toward recording history. Imagine a scribe hunched over a turtle shell, his knife scratching characters into the bone. Each character was a tiny work of art. The character for rain looked like drops falling from the sky, or showed two hands clutching a weapon. Over time, these characters grew more complex, but they always kept a hint of the things they represented, like a memory made visible. The Zhou took this writing and ran with it. They wrote on bamboo strips, tying them together to make books that could be rolled up and carried. Scribes copied laws: do not steal from your neighbor's field, honor your father and mother. They wrote letters: a lord sending word to his son, the harvest is good, send more rice to the capital. They even wrote poetry, like this one from the Book of Songs, about a soldier missing home. The wild geese fly south, their cries filling the sky. I think of my wife, mending clothes by the fire. When will I return? The road is long, the wind is cold. These words, written over 2,500 years ago, still make us ache, proof that some feelings never change. Religion in these times was not a set of rules, it was a way of seeing the world. The Shang believed the universe was crowded with spirits, ancestors who watched over their families, mountain spirits that controlled the rains, river gods that could flood fields if angered. To keep them happy, people made offerings: a bowl of millet for a household ancestor, a sheep for a mountain spirit, a jade disc for the highest god, D. The Zhou softened this view. They spoke of heaven, Tian, not a grumpy god who needed bribes, but a wise force that cared about justice. Heaven sees what the people see, they said. Heaven hears what the people hear. This meant a king could not rule with cruelty and expect to stay in power. If he starved his people or ignored their cries, heaven would take his throne away and give it to someone better. This idea, the mandate of heaven, was like a promise: good rulers would be rewarded, bad ones would fall. It gave people hope, even when times were hard. Ancestor worship remained at the heart of daily life. Every home had a small shrine, with wooden tablets carved with the names of dead parents and grandparents. Each morning, the head of the family would light incense and bow, saying, "Please protect us today." On festivals, they would set out food: steamed buns for a grandmother who loved them, wine for a grandfather who had enjoyed a drink. It was a way of keeping the past alive, of feeling that loved ones were still part of the family. Rituals governed almost everything, from birth to death. When a baby was born, the father would write its name on a piece of bamboo and place it on the family shrine, officially welcoming the child into the clan. When two people married, they would bow to each other, to their parents, and to heaven, promising to care for each other until death do us part. When someone died, their body was washed with rice water, dressed in their finest clothes, and buried with things they might need in the afterlife: a comb for a woman who liked to fix her hair, a knife for a man who had been a hunter. The Zhou turned these rituals into a system called Li, not just manners, but a way to keep society harmonious. Li told people how to behave based on who they were: a king bowed to heaven, a son bowed to his father, a servant bowed to his master. It sounds strict, but it had a purpose. If everyone knew their place, there would be no fighting. Music was part of it too. The Zhou loved their bells, rows of them, big and small, that played melodies when struck. At a royal feast, the music would change as different nobles spoke: a high, clear bell for a prince, a deep, rumbling one for a great lord. The music did not just sound nice, it showed who was important, like a song of order. Of course, no culture stands still. As the Zhou dynasty grew older, some people began to question the old ways. Scholars wandered from kingdom to kingdom, talking about how to make society better. One of them, named Confucius, would later teach, "What you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others," a simple idea that still guides us today. But even as new ideas took root, the old ones stayed: the love of bronze, the power of writing, the respect for ancestors. Let us linger a moment in this world. Imagine walking through a Zhou village at dusk. Smoke curls from rooftops as families cook dinner. A mother calls her children home, their laughter fading as they run toward the house. In the distance, a temple bell rings, slow and deep, calling people to prayer. Somewhere, a scribe copies a poem onto bamboo, his brush moving like a dancer. This is the magic of Shang and Zhou culture. It was not just grand palaces and fancy rituals. It was in the small things: the way a father taught his son to carve jade, the way a mother sang a lullaby from her own childhood, the way people looked up at the stars and wondered, "What does heaven want from us?" These questions, and the answers they found in bronze, writing, and ritual, would shape China for thousands of years. They were not perfect answers, but they were their answers, given with all the heart and curiosity that makes us human. And in that, they are still ours. Let us drift into the quiet order of the early Zhou dynasty, where power was woven like a net, loose enough to let regions breathe, tight enough to hold the kingdom together. After the chaos of overthrowing the Shang, the Zhou kings faced a gentle but urgent question: how do you rule a land so vast, with people who spoke different dialects, followed different customs, and remembered the old Shang ways? Their answer was a system called fengjian, a kind of sharing the realm that turned relatives and loyal friends into guardians of the land. It was not perfect, but for a time, it worked like a well-tuned song. Imagine the days after King Wu defeated the Shang. The land was still trembling from battle, and people whispered, "Will peace last?" King Wu, a man with a face like warm stone, gathered his advisors. "We cannot rule every village from the capital," he said. "Let us send our trusted kin to watch over the far corners." And so, he took a map, crude by today's standards, drawn on silk with ink made from pine soot, and divided the realm like a cake. His brothers got the largest slices, strategic lands along the Yellow River, where the soil was fertile and invaders could be spotted early. His bravest warriors got smaller plots, on the edges of the kingdom, to keep raiders from the north and west at bay. Even a few Shang nobles, who had surrendered peacefully, got tiny pieces of their old land, proof that the Zhou were not just conquerors, but fair rulers. Each of these lords, called Zhou, built a fortress in their new territory, a walled city with a palace at its center. Around it, they gave land to their own relatives and followers, who became knights and officials. In return, the lords promised three things to the Zhou king: loyalty, "I will never raise a sword against you"; tribute, "Each year, I will send you silk, grain, and horses"; and military help, "When enemies come, my soldiers will march with yours." It was a web of promises, held together not just by oaths, but by marriage. Lords married the king's daughters, their sons married other nobles' daughters, so that almost everyone in the ruling class was connected by blood. For a while, this web held. Picture a spring morning at the Zhou capital, Haojing. The air smells of plum blossoms. Lords from faraway lands have traveled for weeks, their carts loaded with tribute: jade from the west, silk from the south, salted fish from the east. They line up outside the king's palace, wearing robes dyed with expensive colors: purple for the highest lords, blue for the lesser ones. Inside, the king sits on a throne carved with dragons, and the lords bow low, their foreheads touching the ground. "Your Grace," they say, "the harvest in my land is good. Here is my tribute, and my promise to stand by you." The king smiles and gives them gifts: bronze vessels, fine horses, scrolls with his seal. It is a ritual of respect, a reminder that they are all part of one big family. This family feeling was reinforced by Li and Yu, ritual and music, the twin pillars of Zhou order. Li was like a rulebook for life, telling people how to act based on who they were. A farmer did not bow as deeply as a lord did not sit as close to the king as his brothers. At funerals, a son wore plain white for 3 years, while a distant cousin wore it for only 3 months. At feasts, the king drank from a jade cup, lords from bronze, commoners from pottery. These rules were not meant to be cruel, they were meant to prevent chaos. If everyone knows their place, the Zhou thought, no one will fight over what is not theirs. Yu was the soft counterpart to Li. Imagine a temple ceremony for the winter solstice. Priests chant ancient prayers, and a band plays, bells ring, flutes trill, drums thump. The music is not random, each note has a meaning. A high bell chimes when the king raises his cup, a low drum beats when lords bow. The music wraps around the ritual like a blanket, making everyone feel part of something bigger. Even common folk felt it. At village festivals, they sang songs that told of their ancestors, danced to rhythms that matched the seasons, and knew that their small rituals were part of the same big pattern as the king's. At the center of this order stood the Zhou kings, but few were as wise as King Wu's brother, the Duke of Zhou. When King Wu died young, leaving a baby son as heir, the Duke stepped in as regent. He did not seize power, instead, he worked day and night to make the new system work. He wrote down the rules of Li, so that no one could argue about what was right. He sent scholars to teach farming techniques to distant villages, so that people would have enough to eat. He even created a system of inspectors, men who traveled the realm to check on lords. Are you treating your people fairly? Are you paying your tribute? Are you keeping your fort strong? Under the Duke's care, the Zhou realm flourished. Farmers learned to grow new crops, like wheat and soybeans, and to dig canals that watered fields even in dry years. Merchants traveled farther, trading silk for iron tools, which made plowing easier. Craftspeople got better at their work. Weavers made silk so thin you could see through it. Potters made bowls with glazes that shined like the sun. Bronze workers created bells that could play entire melodies. Villages grew into towns, towns into cities, and everywhere, people spoke of the Zhou peace, a time when fathers did not have to send their sons to war, when harvests were bountiful, and when the stars seemed to shine brighter, as if heaven itself was pleased. But even the best systems fray over time. The Zhou kings ruled for nearly 300 years from Haojing, but by the 8th century BCE, cracks began to show. Lords grew rich and powerful, their fortresses turning into small kingdoms. Their sons, and grandsons, and great-grandsons, no longer remembered the days when their grandfathers had bowed to the king. They saw the king as a distant figure, not a father or brother. Some stopped sending tribute, others fought with neighboring lords over land, ignoring the king's orders to stop. To make matters worse, trouble came from the north. Nomadic tribes, who rode horses and lived in tents, began raiding Zhou villages, stealing cattle and burning crops. The king's army was small, and the lords were slow to send help, each was too busy guarding their own land. In 771 BCE, disaster struck. A group of nomads, joined by a disgruntled lord, attacked Haojing. The king lit beacon fires, a signal for lords to come to his aid, but few came. Some said the king had cried "wolf" too many times. He had lit the beacons before just to amuse his concubine, so no one believed him when danger was real. The capital burned, the king died, and the surviving nobles fled east, to a new capital at Luoyang. This was the end of the Western Zhou, and the start of the Eastern Zhou. The king still sat on his throne in Luoyang, but he was little more than a figurehead. Lords ruled their own lands, fought their own wars, and called themselves kings in secret. The old order, of a united realm, bound by ritual and family, was fading, like a song forgotten by singers. Yet even in this fading, something beautiful remained. The rules of Li and Yu were still taught in schools, the stories of the Duke of Zhou were still told around fires, the belief that rulers must be virtuous, that heaven watches, still lingered in people's hearts. The Zhou system had not been perfect, but it had planted seeds, the idea that a kingdom is more than a collection of lands, it is a family, a shared story, a promise to care for one another. As we drift toward sleep, imagine an old farmer in a village near Luoyang. He has never seen the king, but he knows the rituals, he bows to his elders, he sings the old songs at harvest time, he tells his children stories of the Duke of Zhou. Once, he says, we were all one family. Maybe one day, we will be again. And in that hope, the story of the Zhou, its order, its flaws, its quiet faith and harmony, lives on. The sun that had shone so brightly on the western Zhou began to dip toward the horizon, its warm light fading into the cool hues of evening. The trouble did not come suddenly, like a storm, but slowly, like a mist creeping over a field, so gradually that people barely noticed until it was everywhere. By the 8th century BCE, the threads of the Fengjian system, once woven so tightly, had started to fray. Lords who had once bowed deeply to the Zhou king now stood straighter, their eyes calculating, their loyalty a fragile thing, easily broken by greed or fear. It began with small rebellions. A lord in the east refused to send tribute, claiming his lands had been struck by drought. Another in the north clashed with a neighboring Zhou over a fertile valley, ignoring the king's messengers who begged them to stop. The king's armies, once feared, had grown weak, many soldiers were farmers pressed into service, longing for their fields, while the lords hoarded their best warriors for their own defense. When nomadic raiders from the steppes, called Chuanrong in the old records, swept down from the north, burning villages and stealing cattle, the king called for aid, but the lords hesitated. Let the king protect his own lands, some muttered, forgetting that once, they had sworn to stand together. The man who would become the last Western Zhou king, Yu, did little to mend the cracks. He was young and impulsive, more interested in his beautiful concubine, Baosi, than in governing. Stories spread of how he would light beacon fires, normally used to signal invasions, to amuse her, watching as lords raced to the capital with their armies, only to find no enemy, just the sound of Baosi's laughter. It is a game, the king said, but the lords did not laugh. Their trust, already thin, shattered like a clay pot dropped on stone. Then, in 771 BCE, the real danger came. The Chuanrong, joined by a disgruntled lord whose daughter the king had spurned, marched on the capital, Haojing. This time, the beacons blazed, but the lord stayed home. It is another trick, they said, turning away. The palace gates were breached, the city burned, and King Yu died in the flames, clutching Baosi's hand. The great capital of the western Zhou, with its palaces and temples, its workshops and markets, lay in ruins, smoke curling toward the sky, a funeral pyre for an age of order. In the aftermath, the surviving nobles gathered like mourners at a funeral. They found the king's young son, Ping, and crowned him the new Zhou king, but there was no joy in the ceremony. Haojing was too damaged to rebuild, and the north felt unsafe, with Chuanrong raiders still lurking. We must move east, the elders said, and so they did, trudging with the new king, their families, and what little treasure they could carry, toward the city of Luoyang, where the land was flatter, the rivers calmer, and the memory of the disaster felt farther away. This move marked the end of the western Zhou and the start of the eastern Zhou, but it was more than a change of address. It was an admission that the old order had passed. The new capital, Luoyang, was grand enough, with a palace, temples, and walls, but it felt smaller, less imposing than Haojing. The king's lands, once sprawling, had shrunk to a tiny patch around Luoyang, barely enough to feed his court. He could no longer command the lords. Instead, he begged them for help, like a poor relative asking for scraps. The Zhou, now effectively kings of their own realms, began to act as if they owed the Zhou king nothing more than polite nods. They built taller walls around their cities, forged larger armies, and minted their own coins, ignoring the old rules that said only the Zhou king could do such things. Some even started calling themselves Wang, that is the king in secret, a title once reserved for the Zhou sovereign alone. The world had turned upside down, the shepherd had become the sheep, and the sheep, bold and unruly, now wandered where they pleased. Yet even in this chaos, the shadow of the old order lingered. The Zhou king still performed the sacred rituals, offering sacrifices to heaven and the ancestors, and the lords still sent representatives to watch, if only to say they had been there. The Book of Songs continued to be sung, its poems now tinged with sadness for the good old days. Scholars still taught the rules of Li, though fewer people bothered to follow them. It was as if everyone knew the party was over, but no one wanted to turn off the music. New powers rose to fill the void. In the east, the state of Qi grew strong under Du Quan, a shrewd leader who realized that power came not just from swords, but from alliances. He called meetings of the lords, saying, "We must stand together against the barbarians, honor the Zhou king, and keep the peace." The lords, tired of war, agreed, and Du Quan became the first hegemon, a sort of first among equals, who spoke for the lords when the king could not. For a time, it worked. The raids slowed, trade resumed, and people dared to hope that order might return. But the BA system was no substitute for the old Zhou unity. Du Quan's successor proved less wise, and the lords turned on each other again. States like Jin, Chu, and Qin, once a backwater on the western frontier, jostled for power, their armies clashing in endless wars over land, resources, or pride. Farmers hid in cellars when soldiers passed, merchants avoided dangerous roads, parents prayed their sons would not be drafted. In the villages, life went on, but with a new edge of uncertainty. A farmer might wake to find his fields burned by an invading army, or his taxes doubled to fund the lord's latest campaign. Yet people adapted, as people always do. They learned to grow hardier crops, to hide their grain in secret pits, to tell stories that made light of the chaos, tales of clever peasants outwitting greedy lords, of loyal friends standing by each other in battle, of a day when the fighting would end. The Eastern Zhou, then, was a time of contradictions, a world where old rituals were still performed, but no one believed in them, where kings still sat on thrones, but wielded no real power, where war was constant, yet culture still flourished. Poets wrote of longing for peace, philosophers debated how to fix a broken world, and craftsmen, ignoring the wars, created beautiful things, bronze vessels with intricate patterns, jade carvings that seemed to glow, silk cloth dyed in colors as bright as the sun. As we drift into the quiet of this era, imagine a scholar sitting in his small house in Luoyang, writing by the light of an oil lamp. Outside, he hears the distant tramp of soldiers, but he dips his brush into ink and writes anyway. The world is changing, he writes, but some things remain: the need for kindness, the value of loyalty, the hope that tomorrow will be better than today. His words, like so many from this time, would outlive the wars, the kings, and the chaos, seeds planted in darkness, waiting for the sun to rise again. The Western Zhou had ended, but its ghost would haunt the Eastern Zhou, a reminder of what once was. And in that reminder, strange as it seems, lay the seeds of renewal. For when people remember a time of order, they eventually start to fight for it, even if the fight itself brings more chaos. Such is the way of history, a dance of light and shadow, order and disorder, ending and beginning. The Eastern Zhou era unfolded like a scroll painted with both chaos and brilliance, a time when kingdoms clashed like storm clouds, yet ideas bloomed like flowers through cracks in stone. After the Zhou court fled to Luoyang, the realm fractured into more than 100 small states, each ruled by lords who called themselves kings, in all but name. For over 5 centuries, these states would fight, ally, betray, and conquer, a period later divided into 2 parts, the spring and autumn, named for a chronicle of the time, and the warring states, when conflict grew bloodier and more relentless. Yet amid the warfare, something extraordinary happened. People began to think differently, to question old truths, and to dream of a better world. In the spring and autumn period, war was still a game of nobles. Battles were fought on open fields, with chariots charging in neat formations and warriors shouting challenges before clashing. Lords followed unwritten rules. They did not attack civilians, they spared defeated rulers, and they stopped fighting when the sun set. It was as if war were a ritual, meant to prove courage rather than to destroy. But as states grew larger and resources scarcer, the rules frayed. A state called Jin, in the north, split into 3, Han, Zhou, and Wei, setting a new pattern. Victory meant not just winning a battle, but swallowing another state whole. By the Warring States period, warfare had become a brutal business. Armies grew from thousands to hundreds of thousands, filled not just with nobles, but with farmers drafted from their fields. Generals used tricks, ambushes in narrow valleys, fake retreats to lure enemies into traps, and even flooding cities by breaking dikes. One battle at Chongping in 260 BCE left over 400,000 soldiers dead, their bodies piled like firewood. Villages were burned, fields laid waste, and refugees wandered the roads, begging for food. "The world is falling apart," people whispered, and for once, no one argued. Yet it was precisely this chaos that sparked a revolution in thought. Old answers no longer worked. The Zhou rituals, once thought to keep the world balanced, seemed powerless to stop the bloodshed. So scholars, teachers, and wandering philosophers began to ask, what is the right way to live? How can we fix this broken world? They traveled from state to state, offering their ideas to any lord who would listen, and in doing so, they created what came to be called the 100 Schools of Thought, a flowering of ideas as diverse as the states themselves. The most famous of these thinkers was Kongzi, later known as Confucius. Born to a poor noble family in the state of Lu, he spent his life traveling, trying to persuade lords to rule with kindness. Lead by example, he told them. Treat your people as you would treat your own children. He believed in Ren, kindness, Li, ritual, and Shao, filial piety, respect for parents. When a lord asked him about war, he shook his head. First, feed your people. Then, teach them. War should be the last resort. Though few lords listened to him in his lifetime, his disciples wrote down his words in a book called the Analects, and his ideas would one day shape China more than any sword. Another thinker, Mozi, rejected Confucian rituals as wasteful. What good are fancy ceremonies when people are starving? He asked. He taught, Jianai, universal love, that people should care for others as much as they care for their own families. He also hated war, sending his followers to defend small states from big ones, building walls and designing siege weapons to outsmart attackers. If everyone loved everyone else, he said, there would be no more war. Then there was Laozi, said to be the founder of Taoism. Unlike Confucius and Mozi, who wanted to fix the world, Laozi thought people were trying too hard. The Tao, Wei, is like water, he wrote in the Tao Te Ching. It flows where it will, without forcing. He taught that the best rulers do nothing, wu-wei, not in a lazy way, but by letting things follow their natural course. If you stop trying to control everything, he said, the world will fix itself. The most practical of the thinkers were the legalists, who cared less about virtue and more about order. People are selfish, said Shang, a legalist advisor to the state of Qin. They need strict laws, with harsh punishments, to keep them in line. He believed rulers should reward those who fought bravely or grew extra grain, and punish even small crimes severely. Cut off a hand for stealing a sheep, he proposed. If the punishment is enough, no one will dare to break the law. Though cruel, his ideas would one day help Qin unite China. These thinkers argued, debated, and sometimes even argued with each other. A Confucian might call a legalist heartless, a Taoist might laugh at a Mozi follower for wasting energy on saving the world. But together, they created a marketplace of ideas, where no question was too big and no answer was sacred. Amid the thinking, life went on. Farmers learned to use iron plows, which dug deeper than wooden ones, and to grow new crops like soybeans. Merchants grew rich trading silk, salt, and iron, traveling on roads that linked even warring states. Craftsmen made beautiful things, lacquerware with red and black patterns, swords with blades so sharp they could cut through hair floating on water, and even early crossbows that could shoot arrows farther than any bow. Cities grew larger, with walls that stretched for miles and markets that buzzed from dawn till dusk. In the state of Qi, the capital Linzi had over 200,000 people, artisans in one district, merchants in another, and scholars gathering in parks to debate. Even in dark times, a poet wrote, the world keeps turning. The sun rises, the crops grow, and people fall in love, have children, and hope. By the 3rd century BCE, one state began to pull ahead, Qin, in the west. Once considered a backwater, Qin adopted legalist ideas, rewarding soldiers who captured enemy heads and farmers who grew extra grain. Its armies, armed with iron weapons and crossbows, crushed neighboring states one by one. In 221 BCE, Qin's ruler, Zhou, would unite all China under his rule, ending the warring states period. But the ideas born in those centuries of division, of kindness, of universal love, of following nature, of strict laws, would outlive the wars. They were the real victory, seeds planted in chaos that would grow into the philosophies of a unified China. In this time of war and wisdom, people learned a hard truth: division can destroy, but it can also create. When old ways fall apart, new ideas can take root. And sometimes, even in the darkest nights, the brightest stars begin to shine. In the chaotic landscape of the warring states period, one state rose like a phoenix from the ashes, transforming itself from a marginal power into an unstoppable force. This was Qin, a kingdom nestled in the fertile Wei River Valley, its borders protected by rugged mountains to the south and west. For centuries, Qin had been dismissed by eastern states as barbaric, its people mixing with nomadic tribes from the steppes, its culture seen as rough and uncivilized. But this very isolation would become its strength. Free from the rigid traditions that constrained other states, Qin was willing to embrace radical change. The turning point came in 356 BCE, when Duke Zhou of Qin appointed a brilliant, if controversial, reformer named Shang. Shang was a follower of legalist philosophy, which held that order came not from virtue or ritual, but from strict laws, clear rewards, and harsh punishments. A state grows strong through farming and warfare, he declared, and he set out to remake Qin around this idea. His reforms were like a storm, uprooting old ways and planting new ones. First, he shattered the power of Qin's aristocrats, those who had grown wealthy and lazy on inherited privileges. No one is above the law, Shang proclaimed. He abolished hereditary titles, replacing them with ranks earned through military bravery or agricultural productivity. A farmer who grew extra grain could win land, a soldier who captured enemy heads could gain status. Suddenly, even a poor peasant had a chance to rise, a revolutionary idea in a world where birth determined fate. Next, he reorganized society itself. Families were grouped into units of 5 or 10 households, each responsible for the other's behavior. If one member broke the law, all would suffer. Mutual responsibility, Shang called it. This turned the entire nation into a network of informers, but it also fostered a sense of collective discipline. He standardized weights and measures, making trade easier, and forced people to register their land, ensuring taxes were paid fairly. Most radically, he privatized land, letting farmers buy and sell it freely, which encouraged them to work harder. After all, now they could profit from their own labor. Shang Yang's laws were cruel but effective. Steal a sheep, and you might lose a hand, desert the army, and your family would be enslaved. Yet for those who obeyed, the rewards were great: land, titles, freedom from taxes. The people of Qin grumbled at first, but as harvests grew richer and victories piled up, they began to see the value in the new order. Qin's army, once a ragtag force, became a fearsome machine. Soldiers marched in tight formation, armed with iron weapons and crossbows, their morale high because they knew bravery would be rewarded. Shang did not live to see the full fruits of his labor. When Duke Zhou died, the old aristocrats, furious at their loss of power, had him executed, torn apart by chariots, a brutal end for a brutal reformer. But his laws remained. Qin's newfound strength was irreversible. Under successive kings, Qin expanded its borders, swallowing neighboring states like Han and Wei, and seizing rich farmland along the Yellow River. Its armies, led by brilliant generals like Bai Qi, became feared across China. "Qin is a tiger," people whispered, hungry and never satisfied. By the 3rd century BCE, Qin's dominance was clear. Other states tried to copy its reforms. Zhou strengthened its army, Zhou adopted cavalry tactics from the steppes, Qi promoted trade, but none went as far or as fiercely as Qin. They also tried to ally against Qin, forming vertical alliances to block its expansion, but Qin's rulers used diplomacy as skillfully as they used swords. They bribed corrupt officials in enemy states, spread rumors to sow distrust, and attacked when their foes were weakest. Far states befriended, near states destroyed. This was Qin's strategy, and it worked. The man who would finish the job was Yingzheng, who became king of Qin at age 13 in 246 BCE. When he came of age, he proved to be a ruler as ruthless and visionary as Shang himself. He surrounded himself with able advisors: Li Si, a legalist scholar who would later help shape the empire, and Wang Jian, a general whose armies never lost a battle. "I will unite all under heaven," Yingzheng declared, and he set out to do just that. The final push began in 230 BCE. Qin's armies marched east, methodically destroying each state one by one. Han fell first, its small size no match for Qin's might. Zhou followed, defeated after a bitter struggle. Wei surrendered when Qin flooded its capital by diverting a river. The largest prize was Chu, a vast southern state with a proud military tradition, but even Chu's armies crumbled before Qin's onslaught. By 221 BCE, only Qi remained, isolated and terrified. Its king surrendered without a fight. Yingzheng stood victorious. For the first time in history, all of China was under one ruler. He took a new title, Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, a name meant to outshine even the legendary emperors of old. "My dynasty will last 10,000 generations," he declared. He moved quickly to solidify his rule, extending Shang reforms across the entire empire. He standardized writing, so that people from different regions could understand each other. He standardized coins and weights, making trade seamless. He built roads that linked every corner of his realm, so his armies could move quickly. The Qin rise was not without cost. Countless lives were lost in war and forced labor, millions toiled on the Great Wall, on palaces, on canals, many dying from exhaustion. The first emperor's paranoia grew with time. He burned books that criticized his rule and buried some scholars alive, fearing dissent. Yet for all its cruelty, Qin's unification was a turning point. It ended centuries of war and laid the groundwork for a unified Chinese identity. The phoenix of Qin had risen, and though its flames were harsh, they lit the way for a new chapter in China's story. The moment Zhang declared himself Shi Huangdi, first emperor, in 221 BCE, the world of ancient China changed forever. No longer a patchwork of warring states, it was now a single empire, stretching from the fertile plains of the east to the rugged mountains of the west. The first emperor did not just want to rule this vast land, he wanted to remake it, to erase the divisions of the past and forge a new, unified identity. His reign would be a whirlwind of innovation, ambition, and iron will, leaving a legacy that would shape China for over 2 millennia. To start, he needed a government that could control an empire of millions. He turned to his trusted advisor Li Si, a fellow legalist, who helped him design a system built on centralization. Gone were the old feudal lords. In their place, the empire was divided into 36 commanderies, each run by officials appointed directly by the emperor. These commanderies were split into smaller counties, xian, also governed by appointed officials. Every official, from the highest to the lowest, served at the emperor's pleasure and could be replaced at any time. This Junxian system ensured that power flowed from the top down, with no one strong enough to challenge the throne, a stark contrast to the chaotic feudalism of the past. Next, the first emperor set out to standardize everything. For centuries, each state had used its own writing system, making it hard for officials from different regions to communicate. He ordered scholars to create a single script, small seal characters, and burned books written in old scripts. Now, a document from the capital could be read in the farthest corners of the empire. He did the same for weights and measures. A bushel of grain meant the same thing in Qin as it did in Chu, making trade fair and taxes easy to calculate. Even the width of cart axles was standardized, so wheels would fit into the ruts on roads across the empire, no more getting stuck because a cart was too wide. These changes were not just practical, they were symbolic. By making people write, measure, and even travel the same way, the first emperor was saying, "You are no longer citizens of Qi or Wei or Chu. You are all Qin." It was a bold attempt to forge a national identity where none had existed before. To bind his empire together, the first emperor built. He ordered thousands of workers to construct a network of imperial roads, wide enough for 6 horses to gallop side by side, linking the capital Xianyang to every major city. Along these roads, he placed post stations where messengers could swap horses, allowing news to travel hundreds of miles in a single day. He also built the Lingxiu Canal, a marvel of engineering that connected the Yangtze and Pearl River systems, making it easier to move troops and grain between north and south. But no project was more famous, or more controversial, than the Great Wall. For years, nomadic tribes from the north, called the Xiongnu, had raided Chinese villages. The first emperor ordered soldiers, peasants, and convicts to link up the old walls built by northern states, creating a single barrier stretching thousands of miles. It was not a single wall but a complex of fortresses, watchtowers, and earthen ramparts, manned by soldiers who kept watch for invaders. Building it cost countless lives. Men froze in winter, starved in summer, and died of exhaustion, but the first emperor believed it was necessary to protect his people. He also poured resources into his own legacy. He built a vast palace complex at Yipang, said to be so large it could hold 10,000 people. More impressive was his tomb, a massive mausoleum outside Xianyang, guarded by an army of 8,000 life-size terracotta soldiers, each with a unique face. These soldiers, along with terracotta horses, chariots, and even acrobats, were meant to protect him in the afterlife, a fitting monument to a ruler who thought of himself as a god. Yet for all his power, the first emperor feared death. He sent expeditions to search for the elixir of immortality, a magical potion that would let him live forever. When none was found, he grew paranoid, seeing enemies everywhere. He banned books that criticized his rule, especially Confucian texts that praised the old feudal order, and executed scholars who refused to comply. This burning of books and burying of scholars shocked many, and it would later be remembered as a dark chapter in his reign. The first emperor's demands on his people were enormous. Farmers were forced to leave their fields to build walls and roads, soldiers fought endless wars to expand the empire's borders, taxes were high, leaving many families destitute. The Qin laws are like a net, too tight to escape, people whispered. Yet few dared to rebel, for fear of punishment. Then, in 210 BCE, while traveling to inspect his empire, the first emperor died suddenly. His advisors, fearing chaos, hid his death, smuggling his body back to the capital in a cart filled with rotting fish to mask the smell. They forged a letter from the emperor, ordering his eldest son, Fusu, to commit suicide, and placed his weak second son, Huai, on the throne as the second emperor. The new emperor was no match for his father. He let corrupt officials, like the eunuch Zhou Gao, run the government, while he indulged in luxury. The people, already suffering, could take no more. In 209 BCE, two farmers named Shang and Wu Guang, drafted into the army, were caught in a rainstorm and feared they would be executed for arriving late. "We're going to die anyway," they said. "Why not die fighting?" They led a rebellion that quickly spread, with peasants, former nobles, and even soldiers joining in. By 207 BCE, the Qin capital had fallen, and the second emperor had committed suicide. The empire that the first emperor had dreamed would last 10,000 generations had collapsed in just 15 years. Yet its legacy lived on. The idea of a unified China, governed by a strong central government, had taken root. The systems of writing, measurement, and administration he created would be adopted by later dynasties. Even the word China comes from Qin. The Qin Empire was like a storm, destructive, terrifying, but also transformative. It destroyed the old order, but in doing so, it cleared the way for something new. As the dust settled, a new chapter in China's story was about to begin, one that would build on Qin's innovations, while softening its harsh edges. After the short-lived Qin dynasty collapsed in chaos, a new leader emerged from the ashes, Liu Bang, a former peasant who had risen to become a minor official before joining the rebellion. Unlike the harsh first emperor of Qin, Liu Bang understood that people needed kindness after years of suffering. When he became the first emperor of the Han dynasty in 202 BCE, he adopted a policy of rest and recovery, lowering taxes, reducing punishments, and letting farmers return to their fields. For decades, his successors followed this path, and the Han Empire slowly healed, growing wealthy and strong. But it was during the reign of Emperor Wu, 141 to 87 BCE, that Han China truly reached its peak, transforming from a humble kingdom into a vast, powerful empire whose influence stretched across East Asia. Emperor Wu was a man of big dreams. From the moment he took the throne as a teenager, he wanted to make Han China not just stable, but great. One of his first goals was to deal with the Xiongnu, the nomadic warriors from the north who had harassed China for centuries. Under previous emperors, the Han had used Qin, sending princesses to marry Xiongnu chiefs and giving gifts of silk and grain, to keep the peace. But Emperor Wu saw this as weakness. "We will not bribe them anymore," he declared. "We will defeat them." He gathered a massive army, training soldiers in new tactics and equipping them with better weapons, crossbows that could pierce armor, iron swords, and cavalry units modeled after the Xiongnu's own horseback warriors. He put two brilliant generals in charge, Wei Qing, his half-brother, and Hu Zubing, a young prodigy who would become one of China's greatest military heroes. For over 30 years, these generals led campaigns deep into the steppes, chasing the Xiongnu across deserts and mountains. In one famous battle, Hu Zubing, just 20 years old, led a surprise attack that captured the Xiongnu's sacred lands, earning him the title Marquis of Wolf's Prowess. By the end of Emperor Wu's reign, the Xiongnu were shattered, forced to flee far to the north, and the Han had control of the Heshi Corridor, a vital passage linking China to Central Asia. With the north secure, Emperor Wu turned his attention to expanding the empire in other directions. He sent armies south, conquering lands that are now part of Vietnam and Guangdong. He pushed east into Korea, establishing 4 commanderies there. Most importantly, he sent explorers west, into the unknown lands beyond the Pamir Mountains. The most famous of these explorers was Zhang Qian, who spent over a decade traveling through Central Asia, meeting kings, learning about new cultures, and discovering exotic goods like grapes, alfalfa, and horses. Zhang Qian's journeys opened the way for the Silk Road, a network of trade routes that would carry Chinese silk to Rome, while bringing spices, glass, and Buddhism back to China. Emperor Wu didn't just expand Han territory, he strengthened the empire from within. He knew that the old feudal system, with powerful lords ruling their own fiefdoms, was a threat to unity. So he introduced a decree on enfeoffment, which allowed lords to divide their lands among all their sons, not just the eldest. Over time, this split powerful kingdoms into smaller, weaker ones, making them easier to control. He also set up a system of inspectors, who traveled the empire, reporting back on corrupt officials and ensuring laws were followed. To pay for his wars and building projects, Emperor Wu reformed the economy. He established government monopolies on salt and iron, 2 of the most valuable commodities, ensuring the state got rich instead of private merchants. He standardized coins, making trade easier, and created a system of equal transportation, which moved grain and goods from areas with surpluses to those with shortages. These policies made the Han government wealthy, but they also angered some merchants and farmers, who felt the state was taking too much. Emperor Wu's most lasting contribution, however, was in culture and thought. He believed that a strong empire needed a strong ideology, and he found it in Confucianism. Before, Confucianism was just one of many philosophies, but Emperor Wu declared it the official state doctrine. He set up an imperial academy in the capital, where scholars taught Confucian classics to future officials. He also ordered scholars to collect and preserve ancient texts, many of which had been lost or damaged during the Qin dynasty's book burning. Thanks to his efforts, Confucian ideas about respect for elders, loyalty to rulers, and the importance of education would shape Chinese society for the next 2,000 years. The Han Empire under Emperor Wu was a place of extraordinary creativity. Poets like Sima Xiangru wrote beautiful verses praising the emperor's achievements. Historians like Sima Qian compiled the records of the Grand Historian, the first comprehensive history of China, which is still studied today. Scientists made advances in astronomy, predicting eclipses and creating accurate calendars. Inventors created new tools, like the seismograph to detect earthquakes, and improved iron smelting techniques. Of course, such greatness came at a cost. By the end of Emperor Wu's long reign, the empire was exhausted. Years of war had drained the treasury, and harsh taxes had left many farmers poor. The emperor himself, now old and paranoid, executed many loyal officials in a scandal known as the witchcraft incident, including his own son. In his final years, he issued an Edict of Luntai, in which he apologized for his mistakes and promised to focus on peace and recovery. When Emperor Wu died in 87 BCE, he left behind an empire that was larger and more powerful than ever, but also deeply strained. Yet his legacy was secure. He had made Han China a force to be reckoned with, spreading its culture, its goods, and its ideas far beyond its borders. The Han dynasty would continue for another 300 years, but it was during Emperor Wu's reign that it truly earned its place as one of China's greatest dynasties, a golden age of expansion, innovation, and cultural flourishing that would be remembered for centuries to come. The golden age of Emperor Wu's reign cast a long shadow, but even the brightest sun must set. By the end of the 1st century BCE, the Western Han dynasty, as historians later called it, was showing cracks. The once sturdy empire, built on the principles of Confucian virtue and pragmatic governance, began to wobble under the weight of corruption, inequality, and weak leadership. Emperors grew younger, some ascending the throne as children, leaving real power in the hands of regents, often relatives of the Empress Dowager. These consort clans grew wealthy and arrogant, seizing land from farmers and ignoring the needs of the people. Meanwhile, large landowners, many of them nobles or high officials, swallowed up small farms, turning peasants into landless laborers. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, people muttered, and resentment simmered like a pot about to boil. Into this chaos stepped Wang Mang, a nephew of the powerful Empress Dowager Wang. Wang Mang was not like the greedy nobles around him. He was a scholar, well-versed in Confucian classics, and he presented himself as a man of virtue, living simply, giving to charity, and speaking of restoring the good old days of the early Han. The people, tired of corruption, saw him as a savior. In 8 CE, with the support of officials and even some commoners, Wang Mang forced the last Western Han emperor, a child, to abdicate. He declared himself emperor of a new dynasty, which he called Xian, meaning new, and promised to fix the empire's ills. Wang Mang's reforms were bold, even radical. He wanted to return to what he saw as the ideal society described in ancient texts. He nationalized land, declaring it Wang Tian, royal land, and redistributing it to farmers, hoping to end the greed of large landowners. He banned the sale of slaves, calling it inhumane. He reformed the currency, creating new coins with complex designs, and tried to control prices to protect poor merchants. On paper, these ideas sounded noble, but in practice, they were disastrous. Landowners, angry at losing their property, fought back, hiding land, bribing officials, or even rebelling. The new currency confused traders, who struggled to tell real coins from fakes, and it wrecked the economy. Farmers, promised new land, often got nothing but more taxes and forced labor. To make matters worse, natural disasters struck. The Yellow River flooded, destroying crops and leaving millions homeless. Locusts swarmed, eating what little was left. Famine spread, and people began to starve. Wang Mang's new dynasty is just a new kind of disaster, they cried. By 17 CE, rebellion erupted. In the north, a group called the Red Eyebrows, named for the red paint they wore on their foreheads, gathered starving farmers, promising a better life. In the south, the Green Woods, rebels seized cities and declared their own emperor. Wang Mang sent armies to crush them, but his soldiers, many of whom were hungry peasants themselves, often joined the rebels instead. In 23 CE, the rebels stormed the capital, Chang'an. Wang Mang, dressed in royal robes, tried to hide in his palace, but he was captured and killed. His Xin dynasty, which had lasted just 15 years, collapsed as quickly as it had risen. Out of the chaos emerged a new leader, Liu Xiu, a distant relative of the Western Han imperial family. Liu Xiu was no ordinary noble, he was a shrewd strategist, a skilled warrior, and a man who knew how to win people's trust. Unlike Wang Mang, who relied on ancient texts, Liu Xiu listened to the people. A ruler must feed his people before teaching them, he said, echoing Confucius. He gathered an army, not just of soldiers, but of farmers and former rebels who believed in his promise to restore peace. Liu Xiu's rise to power was not easy. He faced rivals, other nobles who claimed the Han throne, warlords who controlled vast territories, and remnants of the Red Eyebrows and Green Woods rebels. But he outsmarted them all. He made alliances with local leaders, offered amnesty to rebels who surrendered, and treated conquered peoples kindly, avoiding the brutality of Wang Mang's armies. In 25 CE, after years of fighting, Liu Xiu entered the city of Luoyang and declared himself emperor, restoring the Han dynasty. Historians call this second phase the Eastern Han, because Liu Xiu moved the capital from Chang'an to Luoyang, farther east. As Emperor Guangwu, his reign title, Liu Xiu set out to heal the empire. He cancelled harsh taxes, letting farmers rebuild their lives. He returned seized land to its rightful owners, but also forced large landowners to give up excess property, easing inequality. He reduced the size of the army, sending soldiers back to their farms to grow food. He repaired roads and canals, boosting trade, and rebuilt schools, reviving Confucian education. Most importantly, he worked to end corruption, firing greedy officials and promoting those who were honest and hardworking. Emperor Guangwu's reign, called the Guangwu Restoration, was a time of renewal. The economy bounced back, with harvests growing plentiful and cities thriving. The population, which had dropped sharply during the wars, began to rise again. Peace returned to the borders, too. The Xiongnu, still weakened from Emperor Wu's campaigns, split into two groups, and the southern Xiongnu even allied with the Han, protecting the northern frontier. Yet the Eastern Han was not just a copy of the Western Han. Liu Xiu and his successors learned from the past. They weakened the power of consort clans and eunuchs, castrated servants who often wielded influence at court, trying to avoid the mistakes that had destroyed the Western Han. They also strengthened the central government's control over local officials, ensuring laws were enforced more fairly. By the end of the 1st century CE, the Eastern Han was flourishing. Cities like Luoyang and Chang'an bustled with merchants selling silk, spices, and goods from as far as Rome. Scholars gathered in academies to study Confucian classics, and artists created beautiful paintings, sculptures, and poetry. In 105 CE, a court official named Kai Luan improved the process of making paper, using plant fibers to create a cheap, durable material that revolutionized writing and learning. The story of Wang Mang and the Eastern Han revival is a lesson in resilience. Empires, like people, stumble, but they can also recover, if led by those who listen, adapt, and learn from failure. The Western Han had fallen, but the Han spirit, of unity, of Confucian virtue, of enduring hope, had not. It would take root again in the Eastern Han, growing into a new era of prosperity, even as shadows of future troubles already lurked on the horizon. The Eastern Han, which had risen from the ashes of Wang Mang's failed dynasty, enjoyed a century of relative peace and prosperity. Emperors like Guangwu and his successors worked to heal the land, rebuild cities, and revive Confucian learning. For a time, it seemed the Han might last forever, a golden age where farmers tilled fertile fields, merchants traded along the Silk Road, and scholars debated classics in grand academies. But by the 2nd century CE, cracks began to show, cracks that would soon split the empire apart. The trouble began at court, where power slipped from emperors to two groups: consort clans, relatives of empresses, and eunuchs, castrated servants who served the imperial family. Emperors grew weak, often ascending the throne as children, and real authority fell to their mothers' families or to trusted eunuchs. These groups fought bitterly for control, poisoning rivals, executing critics, and looting the treasury to enrich themselves. One eunuch, Shang, grew so powerful that he was called "father" by the emperor, and his gang of eunuchs terrorized officials who dared to oppose them. As corruption spread, the lives of ordinary people grew harder. Large landowners, allied with court officials, seized more and more farmland, leaving peasants with little but debts. Taxes rose to pay for the luxuries of the elite, and droughts and floods, common in China's history, worsened the suffering. By the late 2nd century, millions of farmers had lost their land, becoming homeless wanderers or slaves on the estates of the rich. "Heaven is angry," they whispered. "The Han have lost the mandate." In 184 CE, their anger exploded into the Yellow Turban Rebellion, led by Zhang, a faith healer who claimed to have received a divine mission to renew the world. Zhang taught that the blue sky, the Han, was dying and a yellow sky, a new era, was coming. His followers, many of them poor farmers, wore yellow headscarves, hence, yellow turbans, and rose up in rebellion, seizing cities, killing officials, and calling for a fairer society. At its peak, the rebellion numbered hundreds of thousands, stretching from the Yellow River to the Yangtze. The Han court panicked. It sent armies to crush the rebels, but the imperial troops were weak and corrupt. Instead, the court turned to local warlords, powerful landowners with private armies, giving them permission to raise more troops and fight the Yellow Turbans. This was a fatal mistake. The warlords defeated the rebels. Zhang died early in the uprising, and his followers were scattered, but in doing so, they grew stronger than the court itself. Men like Cao in the north, Yuan Shao in the east, and Liu Biao in the south became de facto rulers of their territories, ignoring orders from Luoyang. With the Yellow Turban suppressed, the warlords turned on each other. In 189 CE, a ruthless general named Dong Zhuo marched his army into Luoyang, seized control of the young emperor, and burned the capital to the ground. He moved the court to Chang'an, but his cruelty, executing nobles, raping women, and stealing treasures, united other warlords against him. A coalition led by Yuan Shao and including Cao and Sun Jian, father of Sun Quan, attacked Dong Zhuo, who was eventually assassinated by his own foster son. But Dong Zhuo's death only worsened the chaos. The empire split into dozens of fiefdoms, each ruled by a warlord. Armies clashed constantly, burning villages and destroying crops. Famines grew worse, and disease, including a deadly plague that lasted for years, killed millions. "The world is a wilderness," wrote the poet Cao Ji, whose brother was the warlord Cao. "Men eat each other to survive." Amid this darkness, three figures emerged to dominate the chaos: Cao, a brilliant strategist with a talent for uniting people; Liu Bei, a distant relative of the Han imperial family who claimed to fight for the dynasty's restoration; and Sun Quan, who inherited his father's and brother's power in the Yangtze River Valley. Cao, once a minor official, rose to power by defeating rival warlords in the north. He was cruel but pragmatic, recruiting soldiers from defeated rebels and taxing the rich to feed his army. "I would rather betray the world than let the world betray me," he famously said. By 207 CE, he controlled the Yellow River Valley, the heart of China, and held the Han Emperor hostage, though still a figurehead. Liu Bei, meanwhile, wandered for years, take refuge various warlords before finding a home in the southwest. He allied with Zhuge Liang, a genius advisor often called the Sleeping Dragon, who helped him build an army and seize the region of Shu, modern Sichuan. Liu Bei presented himself as a virtuous leader, fighting to restore the Han, and won the loyalty of many who hated Cao Cao's tyranny. Sun Quan, based in the fertile Yangtze Delta, ruled the state of Wu, where his family had governed for generations. He built a powerful navy, defended his lands from northern invaders, and encouraged trade and agriculture. His kingdom, rich in rice and silk, became a haven for refugees fleeing the northern wars. The three rivals clashed in a series of epic battles. The most famous was the Battle of Red Cliffs in 208 CE, where Liu Bei and Sun Quan joined forces to defeat Cao Cao's massive army. Cao Cao, confident of victory, sailed south with thousands of ships, but the Allies used fire ships to burn his fleet, forcing him to retreat north. This battle ensured that China would remain divided, with no single warlord able to unite the land. By 220 CE, the Han dynasty's fate was sealed. Cao Cao died, and his son Cao Pi forced the last Han emperor to abdicate. Cao Pi declared himself emperor of the Wei dynasty, ending over 400 years of Han rule. In response, Liu Bei declared himself emperor of Shu Han, claiming to the Han, and Sun Quan later declared himself emperor of Wu. The Three Kingdoms period had begun. The fall of the Han was not just the end of a dynasty, it was the end of an era. The unified empire that had defined China for centuries was gone, replaced by warring states. Yet even in this chaos, the Han legacy lived on. People still spoke of Confucian virtues, traded along the Silk Road, and dreamed of a united China. The Three Kingdoms would fight for decades, but the idea of unity, planted by the Qin, nurtured by the Han, would never die. It was only a matter of time before a new dynasty rose to reclaim it. The fall of the Han dynasty and the rise of the Three Kingdoms marked the end of ancient China's formative era, but the patterns established over millennia would prove astonishingly resilient. For the next 2,000 years, China would experience cycles of unity and division, prosperity and chaos, foreign conquest and native renewal. Yet through it all, the core elements forged in ancient times, its political ideals, intellectual traditions, social structures, and cultural values, remained recognizable, like a melody that evolves but never loses its original tune. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was the idea of unity. From the Qin dynasty's first unification in 221 BCE, the belief that China should be one nation, governed by a single emperor, took root. Even during the darkest periods of division, like the Three Kingdoms, the Northern and Southern dynasties, or the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, rulers dreamed of reuniting the realm. They invoked the names of Qin Shi Huang and Han Wudi, not as tyrants or conquerors, but as symbols of a golden age when all under heaven was one. This longing for unity was more than political, it was cultural. People saw themselves as part of a shared civilization, bound by writing, history, and ritual, even when they fought each other. This unity was sustained by a bureaucratic system that evolved from Shang Yang's legalist reforms and Han Wudi's Confucian Academy. Unlike European kingdoms, where power was often held by feudal lords, China developed a professional civil service. By the Sui and Tang dynasties, 6th to 10th century CE, this system was refined into the Keiju, imperial examination, which allowed any educated man, even a poor farmer's son, to become an official by passing tests on Confucian classics. This meritocracy, though imperfect, ensured that the government was staffed by scholars, not just nobles, and it created a class of scholar officials who shared a common education and values. They were the glue that held the empire together, even when emperors were weak or corrupt. Ancient China also left a rich intellectual legacy. Confucianism, with its emphasis on ren, kindness, li, ritual, and shao, filial piety, became the moral foundation of society. It shaped family life, where elders were respected, and ancestors were honored, and government, where rulers were urged to govern with virtue. Taoism, with its focus on harmony with nature and wu-wei, non-action, offered a counterbalance, reminding people that some things were beyond human control. Legalism, though criticized for its harshness, contributed the idea that laws should apply to everyone, regardless of status. These philosophies did not compete, they blended, creating a flexible worldview that could adapt to changing times. In art and literature, ancient China set standards that would inspire generations. The Book of Songs, with its simple, heartfelt verses, established a tradition of poetry that reached new heights in the Tang dynasty. Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian created a model for historical writing, objective, comprehensive, and filled with vivid stories, that Chinese historians followed for 2 millennia. Bronze vessels, jade carvings, and pottery from the Shang and Zhou dynasties set a bar for craftsmanship, and later artists looked to them for inspiration, even as they developed new styles. Technology and economy were other lasting gifts. The Han dynasty's invention of paper, by Kai Luan, and the later development of printing, by Shang in the Song dynasty, revolutionized how knowledge was shared, making books cheaper and education more widespread. Iron plows, irrigation systems, and crop rotation techniques developed in ancient times allowed China to support one of the world's largest populations. The Silk Road, which began with Zhang Qian's journeys, became more than a trade route, it was a highway of ideas, bringing Buddhism to China and spreading Chinese silk, tea, and porcelain to the West. Even social structures had ancient roots. The family, not the individual, remained the basic unit of society, with the father as its head. Clans, large extended families, provided support in good times and bad, running schools, building temples, and resolving disputes. This focus on family and community helped China endure disasters and invasions, as people pulled together to rebuild. Perhaps the most subtle but powerful legacy was a sense of history. Ancient Chinese believed that the past was a mirror for the present. Emperors studied history to avoid their predecessors' mistakes, scholars wrote commentaries on ancient texts to apply their wisdom to new problems, even ordinary people told stories of kings and heroes from long ago, passing down values from one generation to the next. This historical consciousness gave China a sense of continuity, a feeling that it was part of a great, unbroken story. Of course, this legacy was not without flaws. The emphasis on unity sometimes stifled diversity, the bureaucratic system could become rigid and corrupt, the focus on tradition could slow innovation. Yet these flaws were part of the same tapestry as its strengths. China's ability to adapt, to borrow ideas from others, like Buddhism, to reform its institutions, like the civil service, to rebuild after disasters, came from its ancient roots. Today, when we look at China, we see the echoes of its ancient past. The written characters used today evolved from oracle bone inscriptions. Confucian values still shape ideas of family and society, the dream of national unity remains powerful. The ancient Chinese did not just build a civilization, they built a way of seeing the world, one that has lasted longer than almost any other in human history. In the end, the story of ancient China is more than a tale of kings and battles, inventions and philosophies. It is the story of a people who, for thousands of years, struggled, innovated, and dreamed of a better world. Their legacy is not just in the artifacts they left behind, but in the ideas that still guide us, the belief that people can live together in harmony, that knowledge is power, and that the past is always with us, shaping our present and our future. Now, as the stars rise and the world grows quiet, let these stories of ancient China drift with you into sleep. May your dreams be filled with the rustle of silk on the Silk Road, the chime of bronze bells in a Zhou temple, and the wisdom of Confucius and Laozi whispering through the ages. Good night, and sweet dreams.